Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are going deep into the world of literary analysis. Like, ever wished you could unlock those secrets behind those amazing novels and poems? Well, that's what we're going to try to do today.
Hmm.
We're dissecting this literature quiz by Dr. Jaswant Rathod, and we're not really going for the right answers. It's more about how he makes us think about how literature really works.
Yeah, it's not just about the plot twists or character arcs, is it? This quiz goes deeper. It asks about how writers think, how society shapes what they write, even how the music of language plays a role.
Okay, so you're saying there's more to a book than just the story. No way.
Think about it. Could Shakespeare have known how we'd see his plays centuries later? Or how Jane Austen's take on society still kind of hits home for us?
Hmm.
Those are just a couple of the big questions this quiz will have you thinking about.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So let's crack this quiz open and see what we can find. Dr. Rathod starts off asking about the school of thought that considers writers neurotic daydreamers. And the answer is the psychological view. But what does that even mean? Can we really psychoanalyze authors from their work, like they're on a therapist's couch?
That's a question that's been around forever.
Hmm.
Is it right to use an author's work to understand their mind? Does it help understand their writing, or is it just literary gossip?
Yeah.
The quiz doesn't take sides, which is interesting.
I see what you mean. Like Sylvia Plath, her poems are really personal. And knowing about her struggles with depression, it adds another level when you read it.
Yeah.
But is that the right way to read her work? Or am I letting what I know about her life affect what she's actually saying in the poems?
Exactly. It's a tricky thing. The quiz reminds us that authors are products of their time,
Mm-hmm.
and their background. It even says that a writer's success is often because of society, not just talent. So this makes me think, does the meaning of a work change over time, like as society changes?
That's a cool idea. Imagine reading The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn now versus when it came out.
Right.
The way we see race in society has changed so much, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the book hits differently depending on when you read it.
Exactly. And that's why analyzing literature is so much more than just saying what the author meant.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
It's about engaging with the text, the author, and ourselves as readers. It's
Yeah.
an ongoing thing, not a one-time answer.
Okay, so we're like active participants, not just passive readers. I
Yeah.
dig that. But how does this all connect to Dr. Rathod's quiz?
Right.
Is he saying we need a psychology degree and a history textbook to understand a novel?
Not necessarily. I think he's more interested in how writers use language, the words, the sounds, the sentences, to build their work.
Mm.
Like a painter with their colors or a sculptor with their clay.
Mm.
Authors have these tools they use to make something beautiful or, something that makes you think.
So it's not just what they say, but how they say it. Like those super descriptive parts in Lord of the Rings. I can practically smell those pine needles and feel that chill just from Tolkien's words.
Exactly. He's using those tools to create an experience.
Wow.
Dr. Rathod even points out that those Chinese ideograms, with their visual element, contribute to the overall feeling of a poem. It's like those characters are doing two things at once. They convey meaning both visually and when you say them out loud.
Whoa, that's crazy. It's like calligraphy meets literature. This makes me realize there's so much going on beneath the words. We might miss all this sound, rhythm, and visual stuff at first glance.
And that's why looking deeper is so cool. We start to appreciate the art, the choices authors make to get certain effects. Think about how the rhythm of a poem can change how you feel when you're reading. A slow, steady beat might feel sad, while a fast, choppy rhythm could feel anxious or excited.
It's like music for your mind, right? The way words are put together actually affects how we feel when we read. It's not just about understanding the dictionary definitions, it's about experiencing the language in a different way.
Yeah, spot on. Dr. Rathod highlights how the sound of language is like the foundation of literature. He mentions euphony, which is that nice combo of sounds, that we often find in poetry. But he reminds us that even harsh sounds, when they are used on purpose, can have a big impact, too.
Okay, so it's not just about pretty sounding words all the time. Sometimes a harsh or unexpected word can be powerful, like in a horror story. And the author throws in this really guttural word, it can make you like squirm. That's pretty cool.
Exactly. Authors use a whole bunch of sound techniques like alliteration and assonance and, onomatopoeia to create a more immersive and memorable experience for the reader. These are their tools, if you will.
So it's like they're writing a symphony, but with words instead of notes.
Yes.
And depending on how they arrange those words, they can make us feel different things and create different effects.
Exactly. And this leads to another interesting point Dr. Rathod makes, the reader's role. He says that every reading of a poem is basically a performance, unique to that reader in that moment.
Wait, so are you saying how I read a poem is different from how you read the same poem? And both are okay?
Totally. He even says a poem is the experience of the right kind of reader. It's a radical idea, isn't it?
Yeah.
The poem is there on the page, but it comes alive in the mind of the person reading it, shaped by their own life, emotions, and understanding of language.
Wow, that's deep. So it's like the author gives you the blueprint, the words and structure, but the reader actually builds the house, and everyone's house is going to be a little different, even if they use the same blueprint.
Exactly. And this brings us back to that structure thing we talked about. Think of the poem's structure as the support for the reader's experience. It gives you a framework, some guideposts, but there's still room for your own interpretation.
This is blowing my mind. So it's like a dance between what the author wants to say and how the reader understands it, and the structure is like the choreographer, guiding the steps but letting you improvise a little.
I couldn't have put it better myself. And that's just the beginning. There's so much more to explore in this quiz, from the power of imagery and symbolism to the lasting appeal of myths.
Buckle up then, because I'm ready to dive even deeper into this literary ocean. This is way cooler than I ever thought. Okay, so you mentioned imagery and symbolism. I've always thought it's so cool how authors can paint those really vivid pictures with words. It's like you're watching a movie in your head, but you get to direct it and add your own special effects.
Right, and symbolism takes those images and adds even more meaning.
Yeah.
Like those little details that make you think, wait, there's got to be something more to this.
Like that green light Gatsby is always staring at. It's just the light, right?
Yeah.
But it means so much more. His desire for Daisy, the American dream gone wrong, all that stuff.
Right. Dr. Rathod even quotes Ezra Pound, who said that imagery is an intellectual and emotional complex in an instant of time. The green light's a great example. It packs so much meaning into one image.
So it's like those Where's Waldo pictures where there is a ton of detail and then these little hidden things pop out at you.
I like that comparison. And, sometimes those hidden meanings were put there by the author, like clues leading you to a deeper understanding. And sometimes they're more open to your own interpretation based on your own background.
So a symbol can mean different things to different people. That's kind of cool. Makes literature more interactive, like a choose-your-own-adventure for your brain.
That's what's great about it. Speaking of ancient stories with hidden meanings, Dr. Rathod gets into myth. He reminds us that myths aren't just bedtime stories for adults.
Right.
They often deal with these big universal themes that, stick with us across cultures and time.
Yeah, like the hero's journey, that idea of facing challenges and coming out changed. You see that everywhere. Star Wars, Harry Potter, probably every Disney movie. It's not that those stories are literally true, but they speak to something inside us.
Exactly. Dr. Rathod points out that myths are often seen as different from things like history or science. They're not about facts, but about exploring what it means to be human, our hopes and fears, how we find meaning in a crazy world. They give us a framework for understanding ourselves and our place in the bigger picture.
It's like they're giving us a map, but instead of streets, it's labeled with things like love, loss, betrayal, all those big life things we go through.
Precisely. Now, are you ready to meet some literary giants who were amazing at weaving these ideas into their work? Dr. Rathod's quiz takes us deep into the poetry of Alfred Lord Tennyson and Robert Browning, two really important figures from the Victorian era.
Bring on the poetry. I actually remember Tennyson from high school. Wasn't he that super famous guy who wrote The Charge of the Light Brigade?
That's the one. He was also, the official poet for the Queen Poet Laureate, they called it. But he was popular for more than just titles. Tennyson was known for his beautiful language, his exploration of deep emotions, and his ability to take on tough philosophical questions in his poems.
So he wasn't just writing rhyming dictionaries, he was dealing with some pretty big ideas. That's impressive. Dr. Rathod's quiz even mentions that Tennyson was part of this group called the Apostles while he was at Cambridge. Sounds like a secret society for super smart people.
They were a pretty influential group.
Yeah.
And that intellectual curiosity is clear in Tennyson's work. The quiz also highlights his interest in classical mythology, which he often used in his poems. Take the Lotus Eaters, for example. It's based on the Odyssey, but Tennyson, puts his own spin on it.
So it's like he's taking these old stories and remixing them for modern audiences, kind of like all those live-action Disney remakes they're doing these days. But what about specific poems Dr. Rathod looks at? I'm ready to analyze some poetry.
Well, one of my favorites is The Lady of Shalott. It's this hauntingly beautiful poem, full of symbolism about a woman stuck in a tower. She can only see the world through reflections. She's not allowed to look directly outside.
Ooh, that sounds like a metaphor for something like maybe how society limits women. Or maybe it's about the dangers of living in a world of illusions.
Exactly. It can be interpreted in so many ways. Dr. Rathod points out that each of the poem's 4 parts ends with a quote. This creates a sense of like something bad's going to happen, like we're seeing her tragic fate through these little pronouncements.
It's like those quotes are cracks in her world, showing the darkness just outside. And the way Tennyson describes her surroundings, all those shadows, weaving and flowing water, it's so real. You can almost feel her trapped in this pretty but suffocating place.
And then there's In Memoriam, which is a much longer and more personal work that Tennyson wrote after his close friend Arthur Hallam died. It's called an elegy, a poem about grief and thinking about loss.
It's interesting you mentioned the structure because Dr. Rathod points out that each part is written in these rhyming 4-line stanzas with a specific rhyme scheme. It's like that formal structure gives a shape to Tennyson's grief, gives it order in the middle of all the chaos.
That's a great point. And it shows how the form of a poem can reflect what it's about. The strictness of the structure could reflect Tennyson's struggle to deal with his loss, to, impose order on a world that suddenly feels meaningless.
Like he's holding on to that structure, to those rhymes, to stay afloat in all the sadness.
Yeah.
Pretty powerful stuff. Dr. Rathod also mentions the epic, which has Morte d'Arthur in it. Apparently it was going to be part of a bigger work. I always love that kind of behind-the-scenes stuff.
Right. It shows us the creative process. We think of these works as finished products, but they change over time. It makes you wonder what else might be out there, hidden away, waiting to be found.
Okay, enough about Tennyson. Let's talk about Robert Browning, the other poetry star of the Victorian era. What's his story?
Well, Browning was all about the dramatic and, psychological sides of people. He loved exploring those darker parts of the mind. His poems often sound like a character is speaking directly to you, revealing themselves and their motivations through their words. Dr. Rathod also mentions that Browning spent a lot of time in Italy, and that shows up in a lot of his poems.
So he's like a Victorian travel blogger, but instead of Instagram posts, he's writing poems about Italian art. Count me in.
He definitely loved details and history. But let's talk about one of his most famous poems, My Last Duchess. This one's intense. It's a duke showing off a portrait of his dead wife. But as he talks, you realize he's not really sad she's gone.
Sounds interesting. What's he hiding?
Well, Dr. Rathod points out that Browning uses 2-line rhymes throughout the poem. This creates a feeling of being trapped, mirroring the duke's personality. He's obsessed with power and control even after she's dead. As he talks about her, we see that she was a lively, independent woman. He was probably jealous and controlling.
Ugh, that's not cool. It's like we're stuck in a room with him, listening to him brag about how possessive he was. Creepy, but also fascinating. Browning doesn't directly tell us what happened to her, but he hints enough that we can figure out her tragic fate.
Exactly. It's that subtle way of writing that makes Browning so good. Another poem that shows his skill is Soliloquy of the Spanish Cloister. In this one, we're basically listening in on a monk's thoughts, and trust me, this guy is not a saint.
Okay, tell me more. What's this monk doing?
Well, Dr. Rathod says that the speaker in this poem is separate from the poet himself and isn't talking to anyone in particular. We're hearing his raw thoughts, and they're full of jealousy, resentment, and desires he's holding back. He's fixated on another monk, Brother Lawrence, and not in a good way.
It's like a psychological thriller, but in poem form. Browning really gets into this guy's twisted mind. And the poem is kind of darkly funny, which makes it both disturbing and hilarious.
You got it. Browning isn't afraid to show how complex people are. He shows us that even people who seem religious can have some pretty dark thoughts.
Okay, now I gotta know which of Browning's poems is the most memorable for you. You gotta have a favorite.
That's tough. But I think I'd go with Fra Lippo Lippi. Dr. Rathod's quiz mentions that Fra Lippo Lippi was a real painter, and Browning uses him to explore that conflict between artistic expression and, religious rules.
That's still relevant today, isn't it? Like, how much freedom should artists have to express themselves, even if it pushes boundaries or challenges society?
Exactly. Browning uses Fra Lippo Lippi's story to question those ideas. And the poem also shows Browning's love of visual art. He really paid attention to details and appreciated beauty.
Speaking of art, Dr. Rathod also brings up Andrea del Sarto, another poem set in Renaissance Italy. This one seems more sad, focused on regret and not reaching your full potential.
It's a really interesting look at a character. Andrea del Sarto was a real painter known for his technical skill, but people said he lacked passion. Browning uses him to explore the idea of the perfect painter, someone who might be technically great, but doesn't have the emotional depth to create truly great art.
So it's like he's asking what's more important, technical perfection or emotional honesty?
Yeah,
Can you have one without the other? That's something all artists struggle with, no matter what their art form is.
definitely. And Andrea del Sarto also touches on the idea of competition between artists. Dr. Rathod points out that Andrea compares himself to other big names like Raphael and Michelangelo, recognizing their genius, but also showing his own insecurities.
It reminds us that even super talented people have doubts. It's like that imposter syndrome everyone's talking about these days. Even famous artists feel it.
And that's what makes Browning's poetry so relatable, even now. He captures those complicated human emotions, the struggles we face, the choices we make, and what happens because of them.
Well, I'm a Browning fan now. This quiz has changed how I see his work. I used to think Victorian poetry was boring and serious, but Browning proves it can be insightful, dramatic, and even funny.
I'm glad to hear that. And believe it or not, there's still more to find in Dr. Rathod's quiz. We've only just started exploring the brilliance of Tennyson and Browning.
Bring it on. My brain's ready for round two. Let's see what other gems we can uncover. Okay, so my brain is like overloaded after all that Tennyson and Browning. But you said there's more to this quiz. What else did Dr. Rathod throw in there?
Well, he takes us into the world of epic poetry before we finish up. You know, those big stories about heroes and monsters and crazy
Oh,
battles.
yeah. Like the Odyssey, that story with Odysseus trying to get home after the Trojan War, shipwrecks, a cyclops, what's not to love. But what exactly makes a poem an epic? Is it just like really long?
Well, yeah, that's part of it. But Dr. Rathod mentions some things that define the genre. They're usually these long stories in verse, often told out loud before being written down, and they feature these legendary heroes, the ones whose actions really affect their people, or even the whole world. Think King Arthur, Beowulf, Achilles.
So it's not just about personal struggles, it's about these larger-than-life figures shaping history. Their choices have huge consequences. They often face these challenges that test their courage and, their morals.
Exactly. Dr. Rathod mentions that epic poetry often has these supernatural elements. Gods and goddesses messing with human stuff, magical creatures, prophecies, and all that. Like the fate of the world is on the line, and these heroes are stuck in the middle of it.
It's kind of like those superhero movies based on comic books, right?
Hmm.
They're like modern epics. You've got your awesome heroes, your big battles between good and evil, and even a god or two thrown in sometimes.
That's a good point. And it shows how those old storytelling techniques are still around today. We still love those big stories, the ones that explore those big questions about life and death, fate, good versus evil.
Right, right. I'm seeing how these epic themes can pop up anywhere. But Dr. Rathod also throws in some technical terms. He mentioned something called enjambment. Sounds kind of scary. What's that about?
Don't worry, it's not that complicated. Enjambment is just when a line of poetry keeps going into the next line without like a pause in the grammar. It's like the sentence flows over, creating a sense of momentum.
So it's like the words are mimicking the hero's journey, pushing forward into the unknown. That's a cool little detail. This quiz is making me notice things I never would have before.
That's what literary analysis does. It helps you see things in a new way, to appreciate how those stories and poems that affect us are put together. And speaking of how things are put together, Dr. Rathod asks one more technical question about poetry. He asks about how many stressed syllables are in a pentameter line.
Pentameter, that sounds familiar. Isn't that something to do with Shakespeare?
Yeah, that's right. Iambic pentameter is a rhythm you see a lot in English poetry, especially in Shakespeare. It's all about how those stressed and unstressed syllables alternate in a line.
So it's like a secret code that creates a certain rhythm. And Dr. Rathod says five stressed syllables. It seems simple, but it makes me realize how much work goes into writing those lines. It's not just random words, there's a whole system.
Exactly. Once you notice those stressed and unstressed syllables, you can really hear the music of the language, how it flows. It adds another layer of beauty and complexity.
We've covered so much today, the psychology of writers, myths, epic poetry, all the technical parts of language. My brain is full, but in a good way.
It's been a whirlwind tour, but hopefully it's made you curious, made you want to revisit some of those books and poems you love.
You know what? I actually want to go grab some of my old favorites and see them with fresh eyes now. Maybe I'll even try to write a poem myself.
I love it. Don't forget, literature is alive. We're meant to explore it, question it, and enjoy it. Don't be afraid to really get into it, to dig deep and find those hidden meanings that make reading so great.
Well said. We'll leave you with this. What are those literary tricks that make your favorite stories and poems so good? What makes you feel connected to what the author's saying? Think about those questions and enjoy reading, everyone.